Hello, welcome to Train Signal. This is the Satisfying System Center Operations Manager Prerequisites lesson in the System Center Operations Manager 2012 training course. This is really going to be an introduction to System Center 2012 Operations Manager and what you have to put into place to make the product tick. One of the things that's really important to keep in mind with regard to Operations Manager 2012 is this is going to require a melding of the IT groups. All of the IT groups are going to have to come together to build the puzzle that is Operations Manager into a beautiful picture that can be hung on the wall, right? Well, really, and that's the truth. This is going to be an effort where the network people have to come together, the systems people, the applications people, in order to make sure that everything's being monitored in a way that makes sense for the entire organization. There are a lot of business goals that are really at the forefront of why people deploy Operations Manager. In a previous lesson, you learned that downtime is costly, but really an organization wants to build a solid foundation onto which to run their businesses. Without that solid foundation, which is generally IT these days, really a business is really at the mercy of the IT function and not necessarily in a good way. We're now going to focus on some areas that are necessary to get Operations Manager up and running in the best possible way in your organization. Let's start by talking about some hardware requirements. First of all, this is something that's general to System Center 2012. Virtualization is fully supported. In this day and age, you would expect that pretty much everything that's coming out of almost any company will work well in a virtualized environment. That is the case with System Center 2012 and Operations Manager. There are some notes, however. In a larger organization, Microsoft does recommend storing the operational and data warehouse databases on directly attached physical disks rather than on virtual disks, and this is for performance reasons. There's also the concern that storage doesn't immediately commit the disk. Now, I'm not sure really how much of a concern that really is with today's high-end storage devices, but again, this is just me passing along a recommendation from Microsoft. That's one that I wouldn't take that seriously. If you are running on a SAN that's got plenty of capacity and plenty of performance capacity, and it's got battery backed cache and all the good stuff that you would want to make sure that everything can commit to disk the way it's supposed to, even in the event of a power failure, I wouldn't worry too much about using directly attached physical disks. It's also recommended that you avoid the use of snapshots. Microsoft has always been somewhat paranoid about snapshots in a lot of their products. And with good reason in some cases. Like, the olden days, domain controllers and snapshots could wreak havoc. But it's also to make sure you don't accidentally revert, for example, to an older version of an Operations Manager database and have things get all out of whack. In order to help you determine the best hardware requirements for your particular scenario, Microsoft does make available what they call the Operations Manager 2012 Sizing Helper tool. And that's available for download for free at the link you see on your screen. It's an Excel spreadsheet, so make sure you have Excel loaded on whatever system you're going to use this tool on. And we're going to take a look at that tool in just a second. The screen you're looking at right now is basically a snapshot of the sizing tool that I've downloaded and installed on my machine. In this scenario, there's 6,000 Windows computers and 500 network devices that are going to be monitored by Operations Manager 2012. From a minimum hardware recommendation, Microsoft recommends that there's a couple of management servers managing 3,000 agents apiece, plus one management server for high availability. So basically, this is saying that we want 3 management servers because it's going to take 2 to really run this the way it's supposed to run. And they're going to want you to configure these with network load balancing and that kind of stuff. Each of these servers should have 4 disk RAID 10, and that's going to be for performance and capacity reasons. Each should have 16 gigs of RAM and 8 cores of processor. And that's so it can manage basically 3,000 agents all at once. Next, it's going to recommend you have a separate resource pool for monitoring those 500 network devices. Monitoring network devices is a much more intensive operation than simply monitoring agents. Therefore, Microsoft will recommend you put monitoring network devices into a separate resource pool in Operations Manager 2012. A resource pool, again, is just basically an administrative unit in the Operations Manager environment. And again, you're going to see that there's a recommendation for a 6-disk RAID 10, 32 gigs of RAM, and 8 cores for the servers in the resource pool. They're going to watch those network devices. So it takes quite a bit more hardware to watch network devices. Then we have the operations database server and the operations data warehouse server. And again, you're going to see that there's pretty hefty requirements here as well. 18-disk RAID 10, 2-disk RAID 1 for log, 24 gigs of RAM each, 8 cores. These are relatively significant requirements for using Operations Manager to monitor the environment. I'm going to go over to the tool from a fresh start so you can see how it works. And here we are in the Operations Manager Sizing Helper tool, as you can see. And there's lots of things you can do from here. One, you can use the Getting Started area to learn about supported configurations and really kind of build your own Configuration Manager environment to a point based on supported maximums. The standard deployment option is really where you can get to start playing around with different figures based on the size of your environment. We'll look at that in just a second. Next, we have advanced deployment options. Are you going to deploy a gateway server, Unix or Linux monitoring, or URL monitoring services in your environment? If you are, there's additional hardware requirements around those tools. And then you have some advanced tools, such as the database size calculator, the data warehouse size calculator, and the database data warehouse disk calculator. Now, the nice part about these is it helps you determine how large a virtual machine you need to provision, how large a physical machine you need to buy if you're planning to deploy Operations Manager in a physical environment. If we look at supported configuration, this is going to tell you exactly what's supported in the Operations Manager 2012 environment. Agents. You can have 3,000 agents reporting to a single management server. So when you saw that example before, there were 6,000 desktops. That's why there had to be 2 management servers, because a single management server couldn't handle the load of all 6,000 agents. You can have 2,000 agents reporting to a gateway server, or 15,000 agents in a single management group. When it comes to network monitoring, you can have about 2,000 network devices, or about 25,000 ports, managed by 2 resource pools. So you can notice that as you go down the list, there's a little bit less requirement that's necessary for each of these services to be deployed. And this starts to give you a good idea of exactly what kind of environment you need to build in order to be able to meet the goals of your organization. If I go back to the Scenarios tab, and I go to Best Practices, this just gives you some information about best practices and things you should keep in mind when you're building your Operations Manager environment. This is the one where it gets good. Standard deployment. Now, I kind of wish the tool was a little bit more like the Microsoft Exchange calculator, where it was a little bit more granular, because not everybody has even 500 computers, and you can see that there's only 6 different options from which to choose. A 500 computer environment, a 1,000 computer environment, or 3, 6, 10, or 15,000 computer environments. Now, I will shortly be building an Operations Manager environment for a 6,000 seat client. So I'll choose 6,000. And there's around 500 or so network devices that go along with that. And hit submit, and it's going to bring me to a tab that's labeled 6,500. And so it's a little simplistic. There's already pre-built tabs, but it gives you a look at really where you have to start thinking about from a hardware perspective to support the needs of 6,000 Windows computers and 500 network devices. And as you scroll down, it'll also tell you about how you can choose the right hardware from a storage perspective. It'll start telling you about how much database size you're going to use. So basically how much disk space you're going to need in order to be able to support this entire environment. And you can see down here that we're looking at some pretty hefty pieces of hardware. The data warehouse size is going to grow to be almost 5 terabytes with a 10% buffer. So there's going to have to be some significant hardware thrown at this environment in order to have all of the information that's necessary that's being stored in the data warehouse for long-term historical reporting needs. If we go back to the beginning, if you just choose these options, it tells you sort of what the additive hardware requirements are. The minimum hardware requirements for a gateway server are a 4-disk RAID 10, 8 gigs of RAM, and 4 cores. So go ahead and play with this tool. It's actually a really great starting point for building an Operations Manager environment. It's not gospel, but it's better than trying to just kind of wing it and hope for the best. So this is a great starting point, and I highly recommend that anyone considering deploying Operations Manager make use of this tool for a starting basis. Let's talk about some general best practices. First of all, if you're using RAID controllers, make sure they've always got battery back cache. I mean, it's hard to find one today that doesn't, but make sure that your RAID controllers' batteries are always replaced in operating condition. As you deploy new roles, new practices may come into play. For example, when you deploy network monitoring, you may not do that at the very beginning. You'll have to start thinking about new requirements. For example, creating a dedicated resource pool and management servers to handle those new needs. So don't just assume that because you've deployed all this stuff that all of a sudden it's all ready to go for everything you're ever going to want to do. Just make sure that as you deploy new roles that you're aware that you may have to create some new resources in the Operations Manager environment in order to make sure that those new services can be brought into the Operations Manager umbrella. Use that planning tool. This tool will provide guidance as to hardware needs, and it's a great place to start. Make sure you plan for servers to have a reasonable amount of free disk space. If you're not sure how much space to give, consider using thin provisioning in your virtual environment. And the reason I say that, a lot of people don't, not a lot, but some people don't like thin provisioning because they think it's too hard to monitor and they can run out of space really quickly. But with thin provisioning, you can basically provide your Operations Manager servers with more disk space than they may need, but not actually waste it on a shared storage device. Within provisioning, in a virtual environment, you're able to assign, say, 150 gigabytes to a particular server for whatever that server is going to need. And if that server is only using 25 gigabits, that's all disk space it will actually use. The other disk space that it's not using will remain available to other servers to use. Now, the downside of thin provisioning is it requires pretty close monitoring to make sure that you don't accidentally run out of disk space because all of a sudden a server tries to use everything it's been allocated. So just keep an eye on things, but if you're not sure how much space you're going to need, over-allocate a little bit and use thin provisioning. There are a number of software prerequisites to keep in mind as you're moving forward with your Operations Manager journey. First of all, Operations Manager supports SQL Server 2008 Standard or Enterprise 64-bit. Make sure you use the same version and edition for all of your Operations Manager databases. From a collation settings perspective, what you see on your screen is what's allowed in an Operations Manager environment. For English-speaking folks, the SQL Latin 1 General CP1 CIAS collation is the one you'll choose. For other languages, obviously, you choose the language that makes the most sense for your region. Make sure you have the SQL Server agent installed, running, and set to auto start. Now, we're going to look at something pretty interesting on this screen. Right now, it's blank. But we're going to look at a full, large-scale, distributed Operations Manager environment with respect to the network and to firewalls and how all of this stuff communicates with each other. When you look at the base infrastructure, you're really looking at what you see on your screen. You have your resource pool, which is that initial item that includes your management server, any management servers you may have. In this case, there's 3. And then you have your SQL Server cluster, which is going to be maybe your audit collection servers database and your operational database running on this particular 2-node cluster. And there's a whole bunch of arrows between things here. And what this is telling you is what TCP or UDP ports are being used for communication between all of these components. So between all of the management servers on your screen, you can see that they're using TCP port 5723. If you look up in the upper left-hand corner, the OLEDB connections, basically the database connections from the management servers to the SQL Server clustered servers, are using the standard SQL Server port of 1433. And then you've got your Operations Console, which is using a slightly different port. You've got your Web Console, that's going to basically use port 80, or whatever the configured website port is for your environment. Then you have an agent-managed server, which is primary and failover connections. You may have another agent-managed client or an agentless management client, which is going to use TCP 5723. This is basically, from a distributed standpoint in a large organization, the minimum you'd have for your Operations Manager environment. But there's more. You may have a second SQL Server cluster to support your data warehouse database. Again, you need that for your long-term reporting and historical reporting capability in Operations Manager. And that adds a few more TCP ports to the mix, and a little bit more in the way of arrows between systems. And then we have some other components. Perhaps you want to have Unix or Linux computers be monitored on the network. Well, those talk to the Operations Manager servers with ports 1270, or if you're going to communicate with Unix and Linux computers using the SSH port of 22. And then we have outside systems that go through an actual firewall. These are going to be untrusted computers or domains, and these will go through a gateway server that communicates on the TCP ports that you can see on your screen through the firewall. But you're going to notice that there's a lot here. There's lots of arrows between all these machines. And this can get pretty complex pretty fast. If you're looking at this in a virtual environment, you're looking at lots of virtual machines, lots of storage. And if you have host-based firewalls on, you're looking at lots of host-based firewall rules in order to be able to have all of these machines be able to communicate with each other appropriately on the right ports. If you want to lock down your environment using host-based firewalls, do it. It's from a security perspective, it's a best practice. But in the real world, it's not always possible. What some people do is they're going to put as many of their Operations Manager machines behind the firewall and grouped as possible, and they're going to turn off host-based firewalls for the Operations Manager machines to communicate with one another. So everything you see here would have no host-based firewall, so there would be nothing impeding communication between, for example, the management servers and the SQL Server cluster for the operations database. In a more secure environment, there would be a host-based firewall on all of the SQL Server databases that would have a rule to allow incoming connections from the management servers to the SQL servers using port 1433. In this course, we will not be using any host-based firewalls because it can really add to the complexity of the overall process. The goal here is to learn Operations Manager. Feel free to play around with host-based firewalls if you want, but for the purposes of this course, we will not be using them. When you start looking at specific SQL Server configurations, let's start looking at the operational database and the data warehouse, so that you can gain an understanding for exactly what it is you're going to need to deploy in order to support your Operations Manager environment. First of all, notice there's specific versions of Windows Server that are supported by the database component for Operations Manager. Now this is for the SQL Server side of things, but it's going to support Windows Server 2008 SP2 or Windows Server 2008 R2 SP1. There are a number of different versions of SQL Server supported as well, and you can see those listed on your screen. Notice SQL Server 2008 R2 SP1 is supported by the data warehouse component only. But there are some other requirements for these two database servers as well. First of all, a minimum of 1 gig of disk space just to install the component. You're going to really need a lot more disk space than that. That's just the absolute minimum to get going. You should also have the SQL Server full text search feature installed, as it will be used for searching things down the line. And you need both the .NET Framework 3.5 Service Pack 1 and the .NET Framework 4.0. Reporting Server is same Windows Server conversions, similar SQL Server versions, but the one primary difference is you have to have the remote registry service enabled and started on whatever server is going to be your reporting server. So if it's going to be the same as the SQL Server you use for the database, install the remote registry service as well, or enable it. Now, if you're not sure how to do that, don't worry. We're going to go through all of that in a demonstration in the next lesson. There are some required database parameters that you should really keep in mind. From a collation standpoint, you can see which database collation is required for use with Operations Manager. From an authentication perspective, Windows authentication is required so people can log in using Windows credentials. But the real key there is to make sure that collation is right. If it's not, weird problems will pop up from time to time. If you're going to use reporting services on the same server, make sure you install reporting services. Otherwise, install reporting services to a standalone server. And it's always recommended that you install these kinds of things to a dedicated SQL Server instance. That way, you can make configuration changes to just that instance and not affect everything else that's running on the SQL Server. The web console is brand new in Operations Manager 2012, and it requires that you install the IIS role on whatever server is going to be the target for the web console, as well as the 2 versions of the .NET framework that we already discussed. However, install the IIS role first using these settings. And again, we're going to go through this as a demonstration, so if you miss something, that's okay. You're going to see it again soon. And then we have the management server. This is going to be where you interact with Operations Manager on a daily basis. This has to be a Windows Server 2008 R2 SP1 system. And there's some other requirements. You have to have Windows Remote Management enabled, MS XML 6.0, and the .NET Framework 3.5 Service Pack 1, and .NET Framework 4.0. The Operations Console is where administrators will interact with Operations Manager. The actual Operations Console can run on Vista, Windows 7, and all kinds of versions of Windows Server 2008. This is a console that you're going to see every time you log in to Operations Manager to perform some kind of administrative function. And you can see that there are some other requirements that are necessary for the Operations Console to operate, including WinRM, Windows Remote Management, MS XML 6.0, .NET Framework 3.5 with Service Pack 1, plus, if necessary, a hotfix, although that hotfix can be a pain to get, so you can try it without it if you need to. If you do find that you need that hotfix, you actually have to contact Microsoft support directly. You can't get it online, which is extremely unfortunate. It's not downloadable directly from the Microsoft.com website. You have to phone or email support and request the hotfix, at which point Microsoft will send you instructions for obtaining the hotfix or send it to you in an email. .NET Framework 4.0 and the Microsoft Report Viewer 2010 redistributable package that helps you view reports from within the Operations Manager console. And you can see that there's a link on your screen that's going to take you to downloads for some of those items. This video is being recorded before Microsoft has released Service Pack 1. As such, Windows Server 2012 and SQL Server 2012 are not currently supported. Those versions of Windows and SQL Server were not supported by the RTM versions of System Center 2012. As such, they're not discussed in this course because we're recording this course using the RTM version of System Center 2012 because Service Pack 1 is not yet available. I want to make sure you can rest assured that we are using the absolute latest technology that's available for use in this course so you can get as much information as humanly possible. This wraps up our look at the prerequisites information for Operations Manager 2012. In the next lesson, you'll learn how to install everything you just saw and configure Operations Manager 2012. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.